This is going to be the first study in the USA that has actually brought in two people to interact sexually while we're recording it for science. The last time science really paid attention to another partner that was in the room might have been Masters and Johnson's work, so that's like 1950s and 60s. But as far as I know, this is really the first time that it's been through an institutional review board that we have two people who are interacting in the laboratory. We're measuring both of them, and that of course is huge.
That was the last time we viewed any kind of impulse of arousal as something other than a pathology.
Sex research in the US is no joke. The United States is extremely hostile to this type of research. A lot of people who do this kind of work have fled to other countries. You think the climate scientists have it bad, you just haven't talked to us.
I don't know if you can imagine 20 years ago walking into an office and saying to somebody, "Oh yes, I understand you're a researcher, and I have a feeling we have a groundbreaking protocol. Okay, it involves a clitoris," and there was no way.
I'm very interested in general in anything that relies on a putatively sexual type of stimulation to improve some marker of health that is not itself sexual.
Researchers say that they always knew that the sex impulse had the potential for healing, but they couldn't find a way that it would be safe enough in a container where the results could be replicated and that the person could integrate the healing that they had. And that's what OM does.
Orgasmic meditation is a structured attention training practice. It develops our capacity to attune to all of life equally and simultaneously so we can experience intimacy with each moment.
OM isn't about sex. It's about using a sexual response to get to a frame of mind.
We've intrigued world-renowned scientists to think about OM and investigate OM as a potential for healing.
We are starting a new study looking at the effects of orgasmic meditation on a variety of different health parameters, looking at how their brains work and how they're able to perform in tasks before and after engaging in that meditative practice.
The idea that people can utilize orgasmic meditation to help engender a flow state or to help have some type of spiritual experience or feeling is certainly something that is supported by the findings that we see in the brain. It may concomitantly be useful in helping people to manage their stressors or some of their symptoms of anxiety and depression.
People who had gone through orgasmic meditation, comparing before versus after, reported more positive emotions, so more happiness, joy kinds of feelings, less negative emotions, so less anger, less fear.
What happens is your capacity for happiness goes up and your experience of negativity goes down. It's simple sounding, but if you actually have the experience, it's not simple at all.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nicole Prowse. I'm a neuroscientist studying human sexuality, and we are starting a new study looking at the effects of orgasmic meditation on a variety of different health parameters. So some of the things that we are doing are coming to people who are engaged in orgasmic meditation and looking at how their brains work and how they're able to perform in tasks before and after engaging in that meditative practice. There are a number of very unique things about this type of a study. By having both members of a couple in already pretty unique, and recording from both of them doing a sexual interaction, I think is the first time it's really been done in the US outside of maybe Masters and Johnson if you count some of the things that they looked at, which was never brain response. The study of actual partner interaction in sex has been almost non-existent. We have like a mention here where someone did a climax study and one of them had a partner who happened to participate, and it's not even clear if that was really part of the protocol. They just like mentioned it in a sentence. We have one study where there was an actual like structured partner was supposed to be there kind of thing, but it's not clear what they were doing. So we have little efforts here and there in our science to like try and bring the partner into the setting. But as far as I know, this is really the first time that it's been through an institutional review board and that we have two people who are interacting in the laboratory. We're measuring both of them. We used a mobile psychophysiology lab and recruiting participants from Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York to record all of these measures. Ultimately, we ended up with 250 people or 125 couples. Strokers were almost entirely male. Strokies all identified as female, and these were all experienced orgasmic meditators, people who knew how to do the practice. In general, feelings that are negative tended to decrease from before versus after this practice, and positive feelings tended to increase from before versus after this practice. So anxiety decreased quite a lot. Sexual arousal, of course, went up. The feeling of closeness also increased, as did feelings of happiness. Now this is starting. We can do it manually as well, but for some reason those markers aren't appearing like they should be right now. So hopefully we can get those going, but if not, we can run it and just do it. During this, we recorded galvanic skin response, a measure of sympathetic nervous system tone. We also recorded electroencephalography from both partners, or EEG, those are brainwaves. We also recorded electromyography, so we had an index using these EMG plates in a myo armband of the movement from the person providing the stimulation. During very high states of sexual arousal, the sympathetic nervous system tone appears to drop precipitously. That's not something that we knew happened. What's kind of unique about orgasmic meditation is a lot of those other forms, especially porn, create these emotional responses that are kind of mixed. And what that means is if you show someone porn, they say, yeah, like I'm sexually aroused, I'm amused, pretty happy, but I also feel guilty, feel a little angry, feel a little ashamed. And those mixed emotional states may have negative implications for health. Where orgasmic meditation, the positive emotions still increase, but the negatives decrease. So here we've got a partnered context, a safe partnered context, that seems to really help reduce those shame experiences that often happen with sexual arousal. So we can still have those positive experiences or induce this intense brain state, but without, this kind of mixed shame.
My whole life, I struggled with depression. I never felt a lot of joy. Like I didn't have a big range of emotions above sadness. I'd come home from work and lay on the couch. I would drink, I would sleep, take sleeping pills, anything to make the thoughts in my mind stop and to not have to feel what I was feeling.
So medications are notorious in depression for numbing, and that numbing that happens, unfortunately, also affects the positive emotion spectrum.
When I see how people are treated for depression now, it breaks my heart. The very last thing you need is a diagnosis that comes onto you like an additional sentence, because most people who are depressed feel guilty.
A lot of people who are depressed have trouble experiencing intense emotional feelings and especially sticking with them. So it's that sustained positive emotional response that people who are depressed really struggle with. If orgasmic meditation could help people get to where they can sustain that pleasure longer, that could be a huge win in helping to treat depression.
I'd taken antidepressants, many antidepressants, many anti-anxiety medications, and the best they did was just numb the feelings a little bit. The thoughts were still there, the doubt, the fear, the lack of joy or happiness was still there. So it didn't seem like those provided me with the solution I wanted to actually have the full life that I wanted to live.
What is aimed to heal them in their depression actually just numbs them and has them feel that much more disconnected from life. And then they aren't sure which is worse, the life sentence of feeling disconnected or the life sentence of depression.
In depression, you've kind of got problems on both sides of emotion. Depressive rumination is usually a key feature of depression, so that you're constantly thinking about negative stuff. And then what we call reward insensitivity, that is, even when good things happen to you, you're like, yeah, but I can't feel anything positive because I can't feel emotions, because if I feel emotions, I'm gonna go down that dark hole again, and I'm not gonna be able to get out this time. You can. Here's a path to being able to have those intense experiences again that's not scary.
There is a way that's almost through the middle of that where you come back to life.
When I Om, I feel relaxed, my mind goes quiet, and my body comes alive. A couple of months after I started a regular Om practice, the depression was gone. I had some more life in me. I had some joy, I had some excitement, I had a will to be alive and to be inside of my life.
Part of depression is that you have a very limited range of what you can experience. What Om does is it increases that range, but in a positive way.
We did a study where we did the mystical experience questionnaire with partners and asked them both to complete the questionnaire after an Om. And we found that indeed, people talk about their most powerful Om. It is a mystical experience similar to a dose of psilocybin, a moderate dose of psilocybin, and that both partners in an Om have that.
If you look at the MEQ study at Johns Hopkins, they talk about peak state consciousness. They've looked at it through meditation, they've looked at it through yoga, they've looked at it through extreme or flow sports, and they've looked at it through psychedelics. What they've discovered is that each of these modalities powerfully transforms depression, transforms trauma, transforms the 5 precursors to mental illness.
Researchers used to give academics psilocybin. Those researchers were run out of town, they lost their post, they were vilified, some were investigated, some were put in prison, some are in prison today. Buddhist teachers were considered at that time cult leaders. My second favorite teacher, Trungpa, was actually run out of the country. And yet, today, 90% of all med students are trained in some form of mindfulness to offer to their patients.
So that 700 was thinking about a particularly powerful Om they had had in the past. And their responses were that many of them had complete mystical experiences, and the power of that mystical experience was similar to the second highest dose of psilocybin that the Griffiths group had tried, which really raises the question, could Om do something very similar to psychedelics for the things that people are trying to use psychedelics for?
Healing is not a direct process. Healing is a result of entering into a mystical state. And then you come out of the mystical state, and as a byproduct, healing occurred. You do some psilocybin, depression is decreased, anxiety is decreased, trauma overall is decreased. These changes turn a person toward joy. What struck me is that at least we have an idea of what real spirituality looks like. But I don't know that we have an idea of what real sexuality looks like.
Mating itself is probably the initial mystical experience. And so it comes as no surprise that would be something that Om would trigger.
What does your lab do? I say we study the general health benefits of sexual stimulation. Even though it's not sex per se, it's dealing with and manipulating a sexual organ.
We're designed to experience sexual energy and joy as a most powerful biological experience. You take those two experiences, I can't think of any other positive experience that's more powerful.
We found that people absolutely say Om is not sex when you ask them in a survey. starting to look at things like what happens to the length and quality of sleep of people who Om.
And the sleep study that Chuck's working on the write-up of is actually more than just a sleep study, in that it was, how does Om affect your sleep? And like our initial hypothesis was, oh, well, if you Om more, you'll sleep better. And not to pre-announce, but it seems to be the opposite.
We wanted to go to the next level for the research around orgasmic meditation, and we wanted one of the top neuroscientists in the world.
I'm Dr. Andrew Newberg. I am the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at the Thomas Jefferson University Hospital here in Philadelphia. I had always been very interested in bigger philosophical questions about the nature of reality and how we perceive that reality and how our brain helps us to perceive that reality. Right now, we are just launching a new study looking at the Om meditation practice, where we are hoping to ultimately recruit about 20 pairs of individuals doing the practice to be able to observe changes in the brain and in the body by using some of our very high-tech imaging equipment, including a PET MRI scan, to evaluate metabolic changes in the brain, both during the Om practice as well as during a comparison state, to be able to assess exactly what areas of the brain are involved in the Om practice and to what extent. The way the study ultimately will work is that when people come in, they receive two different scans, one during what we call our comparison or neutral state, where they're in the same positions and doing a lot of the same kind of setup, but they don't actually do the Om practice. And then the second scan and the second evaluation is during the actual Om practice itself. We're trying to capture what's going on in the brain at that moment. This graph is the change in age of metabolism in the temporal lobe in healthy controls. There's basically a trend towards decreasing metabolic activity in the temporal lobes as people get older. This was the graph of the people who were the Omers. Over time, that stick doesn't go down very much. It pretty much stays level. And that means that the people who are doing Om don't seem to be experiencing the same level of decline in metabolic activity as the temporal lobe. I think this has just been a very exciting project, and a lot of really interesting data that we have about the impact of Om on the brain, both in the moment as well as perhaps longer term changes that may have relevance in terms of protecting the brain against aging or affecting people over long periods of time. It looks like there could be a little difference there. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. We used PET MRI imaging to capture the practice of orgasmic meditation, as well as the potential after effects. So again, I mean, here, this is today. So again, I mean, the whole frontal lobe is really becoming very active.
Even the middle part is way more.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yep.
Right there.
I think some of the most important findings that we saw on the PET scan were that there tended to be a decrease of metabolic activity in some of the parietal areas of the brain. This is areas in the back of the brain. Changes that we saw seemed to me to be more reflective of a meditation practice than purely sexual stimulation. What you're seeing here is that during the neutral state, you have a kind of a normal amount of overall activity, a symmetric amount of activity throughout the different areas of the brain, but a substantial decrease in the parietal lobe during the orgasmic meditation practice. And this is something that we have observed in a number of other meditation and spiritual practices, where that drop of activity in the parietal lobe is associated with oneness, a sense of connectedness, a very prominently described experience. There are experiences that people may have, mystical experiences or other types of spiritual experiences. Now, in the male participants, one of the changes that we saw was more in the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes right behind the forehead are very involved in our ability to focus attention and to concentrate on things. And while there certainly is an element of that in the practice, part of what many of the male subjects report is not so much that they are focusing on what's going on, but they get into kind of a flow state. The sense of kind of letting go, releasing oneself, being overtaken by the practice, for example, But there were many different changes that occurred in the brain. And again, I think one of the findings that is noteworthy is that most of these changes were decreases, whereas when you do look at studies that have explored sexual stimulation and sexual arousal, we typically see increases. Part of what makes it unique and interesting from a scientific perspective as well as from a spiritual perspective is that it utilizes sexual stimulation and the sexual energy that's part of that as part of the meditative process. And of course, there are many different meditation practices that utilize regular physiological processes in the body. And so there are breathing meditations and walking meditations and visual meditations and imagery meditations and so forth. So there are many different ways of using different parts of the body. So, sexuality being certainly one of them, I think it's very reasonable to think about that in the context of orgasmic meditation. Then with the research that has already been published, looking at things like traumas, looking at things like depression and so forth, and different emotional aspects, there were longer term changes in the brain, particularly in those individuals who have been doing orgasmic meditation for long periods of time.
Trauma is normal human experience. Everybody experiences trauma. And at some points, almost everybody experiences overwhelming pain and trauma. That's part of being alive. They ruminate and they go over it and over it and over it. And instead of being aware of the world around them, they're aware of the world of fear and anxiety within them. That's like a clogged pipe. Nothing is flowing. Their emotions aren't flowing. In one sense, you could call the post-traumatic stress disorder uncried tears. It's unprocessed emotions that are held in. There's no safe place to let it out, no healing surround in which to do the mourning.
What's possible for OM as a trauma protocol is a really interesting question. We've been thinking and talking about trauma for a long time. There are a lot of theories about what trauma really is in the body, and one idea that is starting to permeate the trauma community is thinking of trauma as something that's stuck in your body that has to get out. And the idea of OM as something that could treat trauma is an idea of thinking something that's also powerful enough and decongesting enough, if you will, to actually break through that and help get that trauma out of the body completely, get that congestion out of the body completely.
Imagine a world where we aren't chasing illness or chasing trauma or chasing depression with even mildly effective means of dealing with them. But I imagine a world where you have something like OM enter as the way that we begin to work with trauma or depression or the feeling of being separate. And suddenly you have people healing through something that makes their bodies feel good, that makes them more connected human beings, that begins to have a cascading effect of positive results.
I want to start with the younger years when I was growing up. I grew up in a family with a lot of women, and I also grew up in a house where people were really critical and hard on their bodies. I just felt like there was always something to fix. And I always had a voice that was saying in the back of my mind that it wasn't good enough, it wasn't pretty enough, it wasn't beautiful. And there's this saying in Latin cultures where to be beautiful, it's gotta hurt. And that's what I learned and that's what I internalized. I didn't think that being hit as a kid was trauma. It was this part of my life that I buried so deep that I wouldn't talk about it, or if I talked about it, I would talk about how common it is in Latin culture. Like everyone experiences that, so therefore it wasn't trauma. There was always something to fix. There was always something to fix about my body and something to change. The easiest thing for me to do was dissociate and stop feeling, and through the practice of orgasmic meditation, I was able to slowly and on my own terms, learn to open up to feeling again.
Looking at the people who went in to do this EEG experiment on OM, and were asked about adverse childhood experiences, were also asked about their level of arousal in the OM. And one of the things that has been textbook about adverse childhood experiences is that they numb people, that they can't experience arousal, period. And the surprising result to some that came out of that was, at least for the people who volunteered to be in the study, if anything, the people who had experienced these adverse childhood experiences were more aroused during an OM than the people who hadn't.
So I was a police officer for 15 years. Eventually found myself working overseas. My third deployment, I was seriously injured. Our convoy was hit by a roadside bomb. I had a teammate that was killed.
He would wake up screaming in the night. He would have episodes where he didn't even know who we were. He would have so much anger that he tore the door off the hinges one time. The day-to-day was really hard. It was really hard. I was watching an OM demonstration, and I thought, I don't know what this is, but I need to know, and where do I go and what do I do? Because I think this may be the only thing left that would get to that point where we needed to be.
You know, for me, it was, I didn't want to be on any kind of medication, or, hooked on pills or smoke a lot of dope or, anything like that. It was just a 15-minute practice.
So how do you unclog the pipe? How do you get it moving again? You got to provide the empathic connection, the environment that enables people to feel safe, to process the feelings that are all locked up inside them, to cry the uncried tears, to mourn and realize you're not alone in the world. Life is beautiful.
I think the different people that try OM, the importance of different aspects of that container are different. And I think for people who have PTSD, other forms of traumatic backgrounds, the safety piece of that container is especially important.
I remember we slept in this California king bed, and he would sleep on one side and I would sleep on the other, and we would face other directions. And I remember being repelled by the thought of being intimate with him. It was such a vulnerable experience for me. I didn't want to be seen that much. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want to become available for criticism, because that was what I knew. The first few OMs I had, I just started to cry, and I realized I actually could feel and that there wasn't anything wrong. And that was such a turning point in my life. It was such a beautiful experience to be able to slow down enough to feel my body, to have another person with me connected in such a soft, beautiful way. That actually opened up a lot more connection in my life and made it more possible to relate with people in a more intimate way.
We had gotten involved in a 30-day challenge where you would OM for 30 days straight. With those exercises, I had buried that part to feel. It had been long way out, and to bring that back was quite an experience. Different layers started peeling off. I remember walking away like the whole weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders.
That happened for me too, as well. Just baggage that, not only what we had been through, but baggage that I carried with me from the time I was a child. It went straight down to the root.
Almost like there was a curtain, and I went through the curtain and went through that valence of good and bad, and it was
It was just this clear, open highway, but it felt like there was an access to a very, very deep sense of knowing, as if I had lived with this sense that something was possible, and I was touching that. I was touching the something that was possible. I didn't feel high, I felt clear, but I felt so clear and so in my body that things that normally irritated me or upset me or made me anxious didn't make me anxious. And there was actually a deep-seated sense of peace. Really what OM is attention training. It isn't as much sexuality as training of attention in high states of arousal, and then creating a reinforcement schedule that the highest states of consciousness are available when you can maintain attention on the stroke as it exists. What you're consistently doing is saying you have access to this highest state of consciousness in connection with another human being when you stay awake, and when you can control your impulses.
What we're doing is recruiting people who are naive to OM. They have no experience OMing. So what would happen if we introduced OM to people who've had no contact with the experience, no contact with the community, who have a serious history of trauma? So far, we've had 4 couples going through the study. To get chosen for the study, they have to fill out checklists that are used to diagnose PTSD. And then they have to agree to participate in the study, to OM 3 or more times a week. And so far, we've had nothing but positive results. We met with the couples 16, 20 times after they've been OMing. They've always reported less trauma symptoms. Almost universally reported increased closeness. And they've also reported increased communication outside of OMing, and there have been no negative reports of anything.
We have begun to tap into what's called post-traumatic growth. What they're discovering is that the same exact congestion that's being used to clog consciousness so that there's that feeling of stuck and constriction, if that is open, what it can do is drive growth. What it can do is drive the highest states of consciousness.
They have strange experiences of time, either going faster and slower, boundaries blur. We described this to the folks at Johns Hopkins. That blew their minds, that somebody who's OMing who's not themselves being stimulated to be aroused actually shares that experience. Anything that we have as humans has come to us through evolution. And evolution selects for 2 things: the ability to survive and the ability to reproduce.
You think of evolution as survival of the fittest, but it's not, because the fittest all die. It's reproduction. It's all about reproduction. And in fact, what you see in nature is organisms frequently doing things that destroy themselves in order to reproduce.
There's this whole arc of a discussion between the animal mating rituals, the human mating rituals, and then the rituals that are part of the broader aspect of human life. And then ultimately how that evolved, positive emotions, depression, all the different ways in which we think about morality. There are many different approaches that have tried to link up what's going on in our brain with all the different aspects of what humanity is.
So the question then arises, what if that was applied to the clog in the pipe, to the blockage, to the being stuck in rumination? What if somebody could access that experience and it could stand as a powerful, solid fact in the universe versus all these ruminations? Could they then not turn their attention away and dim awareness, but turn their attention toward something positive?
My name is Emily, and I've been OMing for 5 years. So I grew up Catholic, as most Dominicans do. I'm from New York here, and I was like working 3 jobs. I was going for my master's full time, really struggling internally, but I was like getting away with it. As I was becoming a woman, I was also growing sexually. I was a little lost. I didn't get the right map, so I had a lot of energy. And the energy wasn't necessarily in alignment with my body. I knew that I loved God, and I knew that that was real because I could feel that too. But then there was the sexuality, and I didn't know how that fit together. I was really wild inside, and I was drinking a lot and having a lot of sex and doing a lot of risky things. I didn't care about myself. Like, I was really rough on myself, didn't care about what I was eating. It felt like, oh, I can let her out when I drink, and I had the excuse. And the problem with that is that there's not enough alcohol in the world that could drown what's true. I was searching for a lot of things, many different routes. So when I started to Om, it was just like the veil was just peeled back. This opened a whole new world of intimacy for me. It started a journey on like loving myself. Finding Om at the time that I did saved my life. This is where I was gonna find the thing that I was needing to find that stability inside.
It was a new experience. I didn't have any real sort of preconceived notions about what it was. I just knew it was a practice, and I knew that from what I understood, help people feel the feelings and emotions and sensations in their bodies that we often have a tendency to just kind of not. When I went into my first Om, I don't know what I was expecting, but I felt soft, like everything was soft. And what I mean by that is like, I didn't have to worry about anything. Like, I didn't have to worry about what I was gonna do next. I didn't have to worry about any bills I needed to pay. I was just being held by the practice. Instead of the way that I normally would live my life by seeking out really intense experiences so that I could feel something, and I would be forced to feel something, as opposed to like stuff it down and be cool and be calm and be collected. I could just lay there and feel.
It breeds a sense of connection. It builds the neural pathways for human connection. So can you imagine the highest states of consciousness reinforcing human connection as a means of healing?
There's a term, duende. It's used in flamenco dance. So the young flamenco dancers are very passionate, very dramatic. But as they get more and more seasoned, they pick up more and more duende. And then they can just barely move an eyelash, and the whole room moves. And it struck me. That's the kind of power I want.
There are novels that have been written about this, poems, myths, telling the tale of a woman's power. To attract, to influence, to invite armies, to destroy worlds, to create worlds. I've heard from woman after woman who's developed a practice of Om that as she becomes more steeped in this practice, she starts to recognize that there's an ability, a kind of fledgling ability that she has to communicate, to attract, to influence, to sway without words. They learn to focus that ability. And that's what we're calling call.
Call is the biological capacity to shift a room invisibly. If women were in possession of our own resource of sexuality, we would be ungovernable.
Om offers the training ground for a woman to discover the power and sway her call holds over the world around her. As she continues to Om, she advances in the training of her call, both by making it conscious and by learning to steer it.
We have electricity running through our bodies. We can demonstrate that scientifically. We do know it courses through and can connect from person to person. This ability to attract that you never really understood, paid much attention to, is something that you somehow learn to focus.
Call is the summons. I got summons. I received spiritual papers that come on over. And from then on, I have been loved like my mama loved me and then some.
I tend to think about call the way I think about fire. There's this incredible force that is both creative and destructive, that is to some degree uncontrollable, right? And that if you can learn how to direct it, then there's a potential for enormous good.
John Perry Barlow says there's the difference between love and true love is the difference between a very large number and infinity. And for me, the difference between sex and Om is the difference between a very large number and infinity. It opens into a kind of infinity. It liberates you of the mind that's keeping track.
Sort of on the horizon are things like Parkinson's is a defect in the dopamine system, and Om may affect that as well.
One of the studies, this Parkinson's one, right, that you're setting up, will look at a small group of people and look at dopamine effects.
In normals first.
In normals first, yeah.
Like we want to see if Om changes the uptake of dopamine in the brain. It just Om and dopamine in normal people. And if it does, well, Parkinson's people have an abnormal dopamine response. And so maybe if Om has some effect on dopamine, it may have an effect on Parkinson's. So that's a two-stage study where first we're going to check the normals, and then if it works, then we'll check some Parkinson's patients.
There I was left with this question, see? Because I have seen 30,000 people go through the doors. I have seen this healing. I have experienced this healing for myself. I did know the science was coming out. If you knew you had a kind of medicine, but that medicine was surrounded with a fear and a loathing and a hatred that jeopardized your life, what would you do?
The world has opened up to me. I just expanded my capacity to feel more sensation. It's really, I can feel myself, I can be myself, and I can fully live.
Through the practice of orgasmic meditation, I was able to slowly and on my own terms learn to open up to feeling again. There's an intelligence in my body that I really got to claim through Om.
I was able to heal my trauma. Through Om, I was able to reconnect with my wife on a different level, deeper than I'd ever imagined. And just through Om, I was able to be a better father, and dad to my kids.
It's not just that your body feels better. Your body feels better, and because your body feels better and because you're not in that constriction, then your perception's clear. When your perception's clear, your thinking clears. When your thinking clear, the most important thing happens, and that's that you can connect again to other human beings, and there's nothing more healing than that on the planet.